Άφηστε να εντάξει κανένα πρόβλημα. Ένα λεπτό. Your Excellency, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the CVAR yet again for another of our monthly lectures. And this time it's going to be a Spanish lecture, or rather a lecture about a Spaniard, about Cervantes. And I have the honor of introducing Mrs. Andry Christofidou-Antoniadou, who will be a lecturer today. Andry Christofidou-Antoniadou was born in Limassol. She studied French and Spanish at the University of London, as well as educational psychology and education at the Sorbonne. Further studies at the universities of Zaragoza in Spain, Nice and Montpellier in France, and at the Pedagogical Academy in Erfurt, Germany. She has published 13 books and regularly delivers lectures in Cyprus and abroad on literature and civilization. She was awarded many important literary prizes in Greece, and her works have been translated into many languages. Her research on Lorca is archived at the Lorca Center of Studies in Fuente Vaqueros and at the Lorca Foundation in Granada. She is considered an authority on Lorca in Cyprus, while her research on Cervantes has been archived at the Museum Research Centers in Esquivias, Toledo, and Alcalá de Henares and Valladolid. In 2019, she founded the Literature Cultural Development Center in Limassol, which she has been directing since then. Andry has collaborated with the Cyprus National Theatre, the National Theatre of Northern Greece, and other theatrical companies with regard to subjects relating to Lorca's work. With no further ado, please, Mrs. Antoniadou.
Thank you very much. Your Excellency, the Ambassador of Spain, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, I am very pleased to be here with you tonight in Nicosia to present a lecture on Cervantes and particularly on my favorite country, Spain, in relation to my home country, Cyprus. So let's start then. The references of Cervantes to Cyprus are not numerous, but they are enough for a Cypriot researcher to realize that he was not indifferent to the existence and history of the island of Cyprus, but on the contrary, he formed his own opinion about what was happening during his time. So, Cervantes writes in Don Quixote, and I quote from chapter 12, volume 1, book 4, "With their fleet, the Turks conquered the famous island of Cyprus, which was under Venetian rule, a pitiful and unfortunate loss. The Venetian conquerors of Cyprus had asked for the assistance of the Pope and of other Christian rulers to prevent the Ottomans from conquering Cyprus. King Philip II of Spain, with 148 ships, as well as the Pope with 12 ships, agreed to help Venice. However, the fleet did not assemble in time, since Philip was in fact reluctant and had delayed the sail of the ships. Cervantes had taken part in this expedition, which ended in the naval battle of Lepanto." The second reference to Cyprus in Don Quixote is poetic. In volume 2, chapter 1, when Don Lorenzo finished reciting a sonnet he had written, Don Quixote exclaimed, "You are the best poet in the world and deserve a laurel wreath, not from Cyprus, but from the Academy of Athens, if it still existed." Cervantes, a scholar of ancient Greek literature and language, with numerous references in both volumes of Don Quixote, may have read, but this assumption has not been verified, works of Cypriot literature, for he mentions poetic laurels of Cyprus. By the 16th century, when Cervantes lived, Cypriot literature was greatly influenced by Western Europe, as between 1192 and 1570, Cyprus was first under the rule of the Franks and then under the rule of the Venetians, who had brought to Cyprus a combination of humanism and Christian tradition, where the spirit of chivalry was extremely exalted. Love, flowers, songs, demonstrations of poetic art, elements that are also present in Don Quixote. In the sonnet about Pyramus and Thisbe, a line from Cervantes reads, "Eros fled in haste from the shores of Cyprus." Cervantes refers again to Greek mythology. Eros, son of Aphrodite, was in his homeland, Cyprus, and dashed off to Asia Minor to shoot his arrows. The fall of Nicosia in September 1570 and the surrender of Famagusta in 1571 had shocked the whole Christian world. On the Pope's initiative, the Holy Coalition was formed and was mobilized because of the Ottoman invasion of Cyprus. Consequently, the Christian fleet consisted mainly of Spanish, Venetian, Papal, and other vessels from Western Europe, under the leadership of John of Austria. On Sunday, October the 7th, 1571, the Mediterranean Sea was in flames when two fleets, namely the Christian and Muslim fleets, met at the small islands of Echinades, that is, at the rocky islets located at the mouth of the river Achelos, at the opening of the Bay of Naupactus or Lepanto in Greece. There were many Cypriots who fought with the Christian forces in the naval war at that time, and Cervantes was most probably acquainted with some of them. In the General Archives of Simancas in Spain, there is a written order from the Council of War to Admiral Mendoza to recruit the Cypriot Pavlos Patrikios in the Spanish fleet, who had been captured by Turkish pirates as a boy and was Islamized. When many years later he was able to escape from his captivity, he arrived in Spain, took back his Christian name, and asked to fight with the Christians against the Ottomans. The captivity of boys and girls, young men and women, was something that the Ottomans used to do in order to use the men in the army and sell the women. Cervantes was aware of all these facts because of his travels, his participation in the Battle of Lepanto, his sojourn in Mediterranean countries, and particularly because of his captivity in Algiers. Apart from the mercenaries, however, there were many other Cypriots who were wandering in various countries of Christian Europe at that time, trying to raise money to free persons of their family who had been captured by the Ottomans when Cyprus was taken over in 1570. One of them was Thomas Procellos from Nicosia, who was trying to collect money from alms and from various rulers who were opposed to Ottoman expansionism, to buy the freedom of his wife Kyprianis and his son Jeremy, who were held in captivity. Thomas Procellos had ended up in Toledo, and the possibility is that Cervantes had met him. I can support this hypothesis for three reasons. A. The Greeks arriving in Toledo had El Greco as a point of reference to whom they turned to help with their accommodation and survival there. B. Cervantes and El Greco knew each other. So since Cervantes had already returned from his captivity in Algiers, it is very likely that he wanted to be associated with people who knew the Battle of Lepanto and who had themselves experienced a personal trauma during the war against the Ottomans. C. Manousos Theotokopoulos, a well-known corsair of the Mediterranean and brother of El Greco, who had fought the Ottomans at Lepanto and may have met Cervantes at the battle, was Procellos' closest friend in Toledo. At the time under consideration, the Greeks of Cyprus and Spain were always referred to as Greeks in the more general term, as one would say Greeks of Rhodes or Greeks of Milos or any other islands. Today, we, the Greeks of Cyprus, are referred to in the political scene as Greek Cypriots, a relatively recent term that appeared during the British colonial rule to separate the two communities of Cyprus. Thomas Procellos died in Toledo, but was unable to free his family. As I have already mentioned, he was a close friend of Manousos Theotokopoulos, who was then living with the great painter in Toledo. Procellos entrusted him with his will in 1603, as well as with the little money and even with the less clothes he had in his possession. Manousos would send them to Venice to the Bishop of Philadelphia, Gabriel Severus, who in turn would forward them to Nicosia to the monk Pausanias, who was responsible for the release of the wife and son of Thomas Procellos. However, on the 13th of December 1604, Manousos Theotokopoulos died at the age of 66 in Toledo, without having had time to execute the will of Thomas from Nicosia and without even having drawn up his own. The Bishop of Amathus from Lefkara in Cyprus arrived in Toledo in 1602, and he naturally became associated with Theotokopoulos. In October 1602, he traveled to Valladolid, where the king's court was then established. I refer again to the possibility of his meeting with Cervantes either in Toledo or in Valladolid. All these Greeks from Cyprus and Greece with whom Cervantes had met in Toledo or Valladolid, his participation in the naval battle of Lepanto, his captivity in Algiers, his opposition to Ottoman tactics of expansionism and Islamization of Christians, it is highly probable that all of these had contributed to his decision to place the plot of his novel, The Generous Lover, in Cyprus. Cervantes wrote the novel The Generous Lover many years after Lepanto. It was published in Madrid in a book by Juan de la Cuesta in 1613, and it is the second of the 12 short stories in the collection Exemplary Novels, Novelas Ejemplares, which he had written between 1590 and 1612. Being familiar with the events in Cyprus while he was fighting at Lepanto, he was informed that at dawn on Saturday, 9 September 1570, the Ottoman army of Pasha Lala Mustafa had stormed the besieged city of Nicosia. Lala Mustafa, having easily subdued the rest of Cyprus, turned his efforts first towards Nicosia and then towards Famagusta. Both of the cities were, in a way, protected by walls. The flags with the crescent moon that streaked the sky above the bastion of Podogataros, as well as the fiery flames and the smoke that choked the entire city, marked the end of the long Latin domination, which began with the conquest of Cyprus by the Crusaders in 1192 and continued for about 4 centuries until 1571. The bastion mentioned was named after Hugo Podogataro, an officer of King John II Lusignan. Historical sources mention that Hugo refers in his will, which was drafted in 1452, to the present well-known building of Hadjigeorgakis Kornesios in the historical part of Nicosia, in fact a few steps away from here, as his own property. The bastions, which were constructed by the lords of Nicosia in 1567 and were named after them, were situated near their residences. Some sources mention that Hugo had bought the building from the Admiral of Cyprus, Calceron Suarez, who was from Castile and had married the illegitimate daughter of King Janus Lusignan. Prominent rulers of the Cypro-Venetian aristocracy were soon to fall dead or to be captured by the Ottomans, but the inhabitants of Nicosia continued to defend it with self-sacrifice. The last battle was fought in front of the Orthodox Cathedral of Our Lady the Leader, just a few steps away from the Gothic arches of the Church of St. Sophia. The last defenders of Nicosia were Greeks, Venetians, and Franks, people of different origins, coming from different cultures and with different goals and interests. However, facing the destruction of the city, which was approaching with the attack, all of them united under the symbol of the cross and the winged lion of St. Mark, the symbol of the Venetians, to fight the would-be conquerors. But their opposition did not stay long to collapse. Historical documents record 2 Greek bishops, some captives, and many Greek monks and priests among a large number of dead. Chaos reigned, while history records that the Orthodox Cypriot clergy, as well as a large part of the local society, actively supported the Venetians in their defense of the island. There were but a few Cypriots that had collaborated with the Ottomans. The political loyalty of the Cypriots to the Venetian Republic during the War of Cyprus was not due to harmonious relations during the period when the Venetians ruled Cyprus. On the contrary, there were tensions with the Venetians, and life was hard then for the Cypriot inhabitants of the island. However, cooperation between the Christian communities was considered necessary at this time. Earlier historical events, such as the conquest of Constantinople in 1453, the conquest of Syro-Palestine in 1516-17, which was soon followed by the conquest of Rhodes in 1522 and the siege of Malta in 1565, just a few years before the attack on Cyprus, showed without doubt the intention of Ottoman expansionism in the Mediterranean region. Thus, the Cypriots, who had been living in fear and misery, acquired a great will for resistance and were eager to fight for their freedom under the threat of torture, executions, captivity, and slavery. For almost 50 years, after the Ottomans had captured Rhodes in 1522, Cyprus remained the last Christian stronghold in eastern Mediterranean. As a soldier who had fought against Ottoman expansion, Cervantes could not remain indifferent and could not but reflect on what the fall of Cyprus into Ottoman hands meant. Thus he sets the plot of the generous lover in Nicosia, the capital of Cyprus after its conquest, not only in a historical and geographical context, but also in a sociological one, giving an insight into the demographic diversity of the city, something that was happening at the time and which makes Cervantes very contemporary for the Cypriot reader. Consequently, different cultural phenomena are present in such coexistence both then, according to Cervantes, but also nowadays. The opening sentence of the short story wants the main character, Ricardo or Richard, to identify with the ill-fated city and to say, "Oh, sad ruins of ill-fated Nicosia, still dripping with the blood of your brave and unfortunate defenders. If you had feelings, we might perhaps mourn together our disasters in this solitude, and perhaps find some relief from our sorrows if we shared them. Perhaps they might still be whole, your shattered towers might rise high again, not as defenders, though, as they were when they fell." The author's wish is that the towers will proudly rise to shake off the yoke and signal freedom from the conqueror. So, the walls of Nicosia were in ruins, in the same way that the soul of Ricardo was in ruins, in contrast to the sturdy and beautiful tents that the Ottomans had erected in the plain of Messauria, as we assume, although Cervantes does not mention Messauria by name, for the transfer of rule of the city from one pasha to another. Wanting to give a picture of life in Cyprus before the fall of Nicosia, but also to reinforce the negative view of Spanish readers about the conquest of Cyprus, Cervantes creates the character Mahmud, who is an Islamized Christian and who expresses his regret for the lost idyllic life that existed in Cyprus during the Venetian rule by saying, I quote from the generous lover, "Whoever had seen the famous and abandoned island of Cyprus 2 years ago, when its inhabitants enjoyed all the tranquility and happiness that can be given to mortals, and who now sees them banished from it, or captured, or being miserable, how can he not lament for their misfortune?" Ottoman rulers usually began their reign with a new conquest for the empire. And it was known that Selim II, who was to ascend to the throne, intended to conquer Cyprus when the Venetians were still in power. The Ottomans' pretext for conquering Cyprus was that the island had become the base of corsairs who were capturing Muslim pilgrims on their way to the holy cities of Islam, as well as that they were stealing the taxes that Egypt was paying to Constantinople. Having fought in Lepanto to hinder Ottoman rule, Cervantes has his own reservations about such a pretext. I quote Cervantes, "This whole empire is violent." Mahmud, the character in the book, will say. A scholar might wonder why Cervantes places the action of his short story in Cyprus. Historically, it can be argued that Christian states had to get used to moving in a closed Mediterranean Sea, where Cyprus was under the Ottoman yoke, and this fact put their ships and crew in danger. The conquest of Cyprus concerned a number of people and was discussed in Spanish society and in other Christian states, even 40 years later when Cervantes wrote his novel, so it was a subject that interested readers at the time. It has been said that the short story The Generous Lover is not historical, but literature need not always be completely based on history. It can draw facts from history and shape them according to the author's desire. One of the reasons that this was expressed, it is because none of its characters is Spanish, although Cervantes had placed the plot correctly from historical and geographical point of view. It is his only work that has no Spanish characters. However, the same can be said of Shakespeare, since in his play Othello, set in Venetian Famagusta, none of the characters are Cypriot or English, even though the play would have been staged in England. Famagusta was then a large city in the east of Cyprus, inhabited by Greeks, Venetians, and foreigners, living within the Venetian walls at the time of Cervantes. Now Famagusta is in occupied Cyprus, and it is a ghost town, as no one has lived there since the Turkish invasion in 1974. The fact that Cervantes never visited Cyprus is obvious to a Cypriot reader, since it is impossible to see the coast of the island from the walls of Nicosia. The nearest coast to Nicosia is Kyrenia, and today it is about 30 kilometers away. Cervantes regularly refers to the walls of Nicosia, which still survive today. The Venetian architect and engineer Giulio Savognano began building them in 1567, and they were finished in 1570 with 11 star-shaped bastions. They were built on top of earlier walls constructed by the Franks. If Cervantes had seen them, he would have compared them to those of Avila, especially because one of the ramparts is called Davila after Antonio Davila, the Venetian official who financed their construction and would certainly have reminded him of the Spanish city. I made such a spontaneous comparison myself when I visited Avila in 2018. All the customs and traditions described by Mahmud during the handover of the city of Nicosia from one pasha to another, Cervantes knew from Algiers, where he was a captain. The administrative formalities and protocol are given in great detail and could not have differed since they were followed throughout the Ottoman Empire. As far as the observation he makes about his time can be considered as timeless. Everything is bought and sold, says Mahmud, the character of the book. Cervantes describes in detail battles and attacks at sea from his personal experience in Lepanto. The theme of captivity has an autobiographical character, since in his works Cervantes, as would be natural for a writer, interweaves his real experiences with fictional ones. In the short story The Generous Lover, the creation of a character who is Jewish and who takes a Christian woman, Leonisa, in this particular work to the bazaar to be sold is not unusual. Cervantes gives him no name other than his trade, and the creation of such a character probably stems from his historical knowledge. In Cyprus, before the conquest of Famagusta, in 1571, there was a Jewish community living in that town. Although they were considered second-class citizens in relation to Catholics, the Jews of Famagusta felt secure, were able to operate commercially and economically, and were able to move to other Jewish centers in Eastern Mediterranean. Most of them were merchants and lenders. This particular character has no name because that is not what gives him an identity, but his actions do, which were considerably significant and because Cervantes is in fact drawing the picture of a Jewish spy of the Venetians, Haim Sharuk. He buys Leonisa, who does not respond to his advances as a woman, and so he decides to sell her in Cyprus, which seems to have the reputation as a major slave trade center in the Mediterranean. Cervantes' use of a Jewish character is intentional since the Jews of the time were able to maintain their faith and also to continue their trade, unlike the Christians who had to be Islamized or sold as slaves or captured. This was the dilemma that Mahmud had to face. Although the circumstances that had led him to convert are not specified in the plot, nor is any evidence given that he really wanted to be a Christian, nor is any Christian name mentioned as his own, Mahmud explains that he was forced to renounce Christianity, and I quote from the book, at an early age and having even less sense. Thus, Cervantes suggests that Mahmud was forced to change his faith when he was young, and perhaps for this reason he is somewhat distant. The captivity and sale of Leonisa as a slave to the Ottomans challenges the Cypriot reader to identify with the story, since it was a tactic used by the Pasha and the Ottoman rulers even 300 years later. The national poet of Cyprus, Vasilis Michailidis, whom you see at the picture, many years later than Cervantes, composed his poem The Woman of Chios in 1890, which tells the story of the abduction and Islamization of a beautiful young woman from the island of Chios. The babe who had abducted her took her to Limassol, where she lived with him as a mistress, wearing fine and extravagant clothes and having slaves to serve her. Both facts were reflecting his social class and his relationship with the Sultan. They lived in a comfortable house in the center of the city near the sea. A legitimate question is how Leonisa had such nice and extravagant clothes, since she did not live in a harem. But this was a custom followed by the Ottomans, who wanted to climb socially and dress their harems or wives in elaborate and expensive clothes. So, on the one hand, the Jew wants to find a buyer for Leonisa, since she does not respond to his love, and sell her at a high price, but on the other hand, he wants to flatter her by dressing her in a lavish way, which proves his social status. Moreover, Leonisa was a slave that the Jew intended to sell to the Sultan, so she herself had to be dressed as a sultana. An interesting coincidence is that the Jew, who seems to own the ship, decides to change its course and steers it to Cyprus instead of Chios. Thus, the two islands, Chios and Cyprus, are once again mentioned together in both Cervantes and Vasilis Michailidis. The woman of Chios never forgot her Christian faith, nor her language, and tricked the babe, escaped to the city's port where her brother, who had traveled to Limassol to help her escape, was waiting for her and boarded a boat to Chios. The abduction of young girls and their Islamization was a routine, a normal way of life at that time. However, the coincidence in the use of the same concept by the two national writers does not end here. In the particular Spanish story, Halima, Kant's wife, reveals herself to the reader as an Islamized Christian, and the proof is the cross she still wears around her neck, in the same way that the woman of Chios reveals herself by showing her cross to the old woman who finally helped her run away. Then, unexpectedly, one of the slave girls reacts in the same manner. She also shows a cross round her neck as a sign of her Christian faith, begging the old woman and her mistress to help her run away as well. Vasilis Michailidis could not have read either Don Quixote or The Generous Lover, since being very poor, he could not afford to buy any books, which were hard to buy then in Cyprus, a country which was also poor at the time, and in addition, he did not know any Spanish. Cervantes, a captive in Algiers, describes a similar experience in Don Quixote. In the story of the captive, the beautiful Zoraida is in love with a Christian officer and desires to become a Christian, influenced by her love and also by the servant who had raised her, who was a Christian, and taught her to pray to the Virgin Mary, and who had also made a cross for her, which she wore in secret. Cervantes writes, and I quote, "She was an Ottoman in body and in dress, but in her soul she was a great Christian because she had a fervent desire to be so." The similar details which exist between Kalima, Zoraida, the woman of Chios, and the servants are interesting. A. Kalima, the woman of Chios, and her servant were Christians who had been converted to Islam. B. All four women, namely Kalima, Zoraida, the woman of Chios, and her servant, wore a cross around their necks, which they eventually revealed. C. All four women were Ottoman only in clothes and not at all in soul. D. Kalima, Zoraida, the woman of Chios, led a comfortable and rich life, but were willing to give it up. E. Two old women play an important role in both works. An old woman helps the woman of Chios to escape, whilst an old servant taught the Christian faith to Zoraida. The story of the woman of Chios, written by the national poet of Cyprus, is a theme that one encounters in Cypriot literature and can be paralleled to the story of Leonisa and Zoraida, since there exist common points between them. Women who are victims of abduction, who live locked up in a house where they are provided with many material goods but do not feel happy, and the Christian faith comes to redeem them. It is a panorama of the life of a number of women at the time. It is worth mentioning that Cyprus was under the Ottomans until 1878, the year in which the British Empire acquired the country. Cyprus fought for its independence and was declared a republic in 1960. The picture that Cervantes is depicting of Cyprus at the time is revealing. Slave trading, Islamized Greeks and other Christians, Jews, Arabs, 500 Janissaries, who were the elite corps of the Ottoman army and were formed by Islamized young men who had been trained, constituted the garrison of Nicosia under the new Pasha, Ali Pasha, Viceroy of Cyprus. Kadi, who was a kind of bishop to the Christians, when addressing the people, would speak in Turkish, Arabic, and Greek, so that he could be understood. The use of three languages by the Kadi, in order to be understood by all, shows a considerable number of the islanders who spoke them and who could not be overlooked. The Jews were not numerous and were then residing in the city of Famagusta, as I have already mentioned. The captivity had two gender-related aspects. Men were useful for ransom, while women were sold to the harems where they were Islamized to save their lives. Cervantes had lived for almost 10 years in such an environment, both during the war and during his captivity. He knew very well firsthand that the entire Mediterranean was full of corsairs and pirates. The corsairs had a directed pirate activity of a regular or non-regular fleet in the service of a political power, as opposed to a free pirate activity that pirates were engaged in. One of the most famous Mediterranean corsairs was Manousos Theotokopoulos, El Greco's older brother, who spent the last years of his life in Toledo, in his brother's house, and whom we have already mentioned. Manousos was one of the Cretans who had equipped a ship and financed the expedition that was to take part in the naval battle of Lepanto, in which, naturally, he himself had participated. The Generous Lover is a Byzantine short story with a happy ending and tells the story of the escaping marriage of two young captives in Cyprus, Ricardo and Leonisa. It belongs to the Golden Age period in literature, with secondary plot narratives such as that relating to Kati and Kalima, that of the Jew and the slaves, that of the corsairs and the pirates in the Mediterranean Sea. Cervantes had many more sources at his disposal than other contemporary writers, both primary and secondary sources. Having travelled outside Spain, sources that were both oral and written. In creating his short story The Generous Lover, Cervantes is writing a story of dual chronology, meaning that the author is living in a different era from the one in which he describes in his work. This is extremely important to be understood by the reader, since the author has particular difficulties to face when writing in order to make his writings as plausible as possible, but it is also necessary to refer to sources for details about the period in which the plot takes place. Whether The Generous Lover is a love story or a tale of adventure or captivity is of little importance for the image depicted of Cyprus in 1571. Cyprus is presented as a province of the Ottoman Empire ruled by a Pasha regent in the absence of the emperor who is in Constantinople. The conclusion is that it is particularly difficult to maintain traditional divisions between ethnic and religious groups, both in reality and in literature. We can also conclude that Cyprus, because of its important geographical position between Europe, Asia, and Africa, has fallen into the hands of conquerors many times and continues to be a crossroad of cultures. I sincerely thank you for listening to me.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Antoniadou, for a very interesting lecture and for learning that there is a book about Cyprus by Cervantes. I mean, how many of us knew that? Very few, I think. Are there any questions for our speaker?
Yes.
That's
A
it.
very brief question.
Yes.
The result of this investigation are discovery that you have made, or your previous investigator had already written about
Yes.
Cervantes and Cyprus.
As I've said, Spain is my favorite country, so I travel often to Spain when I want to do a research. Even my novels are a result of literary research. So most of what I have said tonight are results from a personal research in Spain, but I have also studied many other researchers who were talking about the history of Cyprus at that time. They were not talking about Cervantes, they were talking about the history, what happens in that period.
So Cervantes is the discovery of yours. All you tell us?
Yes. Yes. This is what the people in Esquivia said, the audience. And there were many Cervantes specialists in the audience. And they were impressed that The Generous Lover being a shorter story, which is not very long, it is about 70, 80 pages long, I could find so many details to talk about and present it in relation to my country. Thanks. The gentleman there.
Thank you for your research and everything. Nicosia and Famagusta never ceased to amaze me. And it was a really valuable research. But when I must say that I was a bit distressed when you referred to Famagusta, the old town of Famagusta.
Yes.
You said, as a person who was born in Famagusta,
yes,
and half of my family lived in Famagusta,
okay.
You mentioned that nobody lives there.
I think you meant Famagusta, the new one they live in the old city. And there was no new Famagusta at the time. I think it was a misunderstanding.
Yes, yes. I mean the new Famagusta.
I just want to say for people maybe foreigners who know maybe
I noticed
that
that
kind of perception can come. I know that wasn't your intention, but
no, it wasn't my intention. Yes, definitely.
It was a misunderstanding. I think you meant the word Famagusta,
yes,
but you spoke about Famagusta, the ghost city.
The ghost city, yes.
Any other questions?
Yes, please.
Yes.
Thank you so much. As you described, and also other great literary figures have depicted in their work, the fall of Cyprus, in particular the fall of Famagusta in 1571, and the demise of Macedonia Bragadino.
Yes.
So they seem to have caught the imagination and the sentiment of the whole of Europe. I would imagine, in particular, Cervantes,
yes.
as you mentioned. Have we been able to see that reflected in the entire body of Cervantes' work? Is it something, a spirit there that drives not just the couple of things that you mentioned, but the major works of Cervantes? Is it something that defines how he portrays things and how he develops ideas?
Well, the major work of Cervantes is Don Quixote, as you know. It's a 2-volume book of 1,000 pages, the original book. And there are, as I have mentioned, there are a couple of references in Don Quixote. And perhaps there is the element of this feeling that you have mentioned in this particular book, but not in his other works. Have I answered your question?
Yeah, it was a more general question whether his outlook and the way he thought about things was influenced by the events.
He was influenced at a certain point, and at a certain point of time, and for certain literary works he wrote, but not for the whole of his work.
Anybody else? Well, if there are no more questions, please join us outside at the foyer for a glass of wine offered by the Spanish Embassy. We thank.
Which one is your
John, I said it like, where is it like? Near the Weimer. Okay, because the camera has to be switched off. I will tell you.